Now we're just going to get a different point of view. Arthur Delaney is the co-editor of Legacies of the War on Poverty. Alicia.
Arthur, you know, I am curious. We hear Republicans, all of a sudden, this is Arthur Delaney from the Huffington Post, we hear all the time Republicans now trying to make this pivot, right, where they're trying to find a way to express their compassionate conservatism, to talk about poverty. Most recently, we heard Marco Rubio trying to make that very pivot. Let's take a listen.
What I am proposing today is the most fundamental change to how the federal government fights poverty and encourages upward mobility since President Johnson first conceived the war on poverty 50 years ago today. I am proposing that we turn over Washington's anti-poverty programs and the trillions that are spent on them to the states.
Is that the answer, Arthur, turning things over from the feds to the states?
Well, that is actually a really familiar Republican policy prescription for basically every federal safety net program, and it's one that Congress did actually carry out with the welfare program in the 1990s, and the results of that are decidedly mixed. Republicans often hold that up as a triumph, but I think economists and other poverty experts say it's not so clear that it wasn't just the great economy in the late 1990s that delivered some of the results they take credit for in that.
So what do you think about minimum wage, just raising minimum wage beyond $10 an hour? Would that help?
Well, that would absolutely help. I mean, if more people had higher wages, there would be fewer poor people, because poor people are not just loafers. It's not just people who have nowhere to live. There are at least 11 million people in this country who work, but they earn so little because their job pays so little that they are still below the federal poverty line. And for an individual, that is an incredibly low number. That's like $11,000 a year in annual income. So we're talking about people who are paid very little, and wages, boosting the minimum wage from $7.25 to $10, and then linking it to inflation would do a lot to alleviate some of the suffering that's out there.
We have here in this country 47 million people living in poverty, and that's the official poverty line at $23,000 per family of four. So that's 47 million.
Extraordinary numbers, and yet I think it's a real challenge for the GOP how they manage to communicate about poverty, Arthur, without necessarily alienating their base, which are very concerned about all of the social safety nets that we just heard laid out.
And that is exactly why we now see folks like Marco Rubio and Eric Cantor, people with political ambition, trying to find a new way to talk about poverty, because they are, of course, best known for things like wanting to cut food stamps and not wanting to support a vote for unemployment insurance. And we just had that big election where everyone was watching the news all year long in 2012, and it was Republicans calling Barack Obama the food stamp president and complaining about welfare work waivers. And then they didn't win the election. So there's clearly some grasping for new ways of talking about poverty, but not necessarily a big policy shift within the GOP. Like I was saying earlier, block granting safety net programs that the federal government runs, we've heard that before.
That we're still doing more or less the same thing. Is in Obamacare exactly the same thing that Lyndon Johnson was trying to do 50 years ago. It's just expanding the safety net.
Yes, what Democrats have been trying to do is, yes, expand the safety net with regard to health insurance so that more people who are poor qualify for Medicaid. More people who are middle class are able to afford health insurance, because this is actually not merely a poverty problem. This is lack of health insurance surely is more of a middle class problem, and they're trying to close the gap between the poor who receive government benefits and better off who have insurance through their jobs.
Arthur, would you call the war on poverty a failure?
I don't think I would. They say it's a failure because they declared war on poverty, and the poverty rate is 15% right now. But it's down. It's down from like 22% at the time of the declaration. It's down much more among particular groups of people, most notably the elderly, and we have Social Security and Medicare to thank for that. And, you know, among the metaphorical wars, the war on poverty being the first one, the war on drugs is, I'd say, much more clearly the abject failure.
Arthur, thanks so much for talking to us. I really appreciate that.
Thank you for having me.